In September 1740, a book appeared in The Hague. Its author was a 28-year-old German prince who had spent 4 years writing it. The book was called Anti-Machiavel. Its argument was simple. Machiavelli was wrong. A ruler does not need deception, cruelty, or broken promises to hold power. Virtue and statecraft are compatible. The prince who governs with honesty will govern better than the prince who governs with fear. The book sold out immediately. Voltaire had edited it. Every court in Europe read it. 3 months later, its author invaded Silesia. No declaration of war, no serious legal claim, no warning to his allies. He marched 25,000 soldiers across the border in December, in winter, which no one did, and captured an Austrian province in 7 weeks. When his foreign ministry drafted the official justification, he read it and wrote back, "Bravo, that is the work of a good charlatan." The man who wrote the most famous refutation of Machiavelli in history had just proved him right. The question is whether Anti-Machiavel was ever true, or whether it only seemed true before Frederick had to govern. For 14 years, Machiavelli's job was to watch rulers make decisions, not to advise them, to watch. He watched Caesar Borgia take a broken, lawless province and turn it into something functional through executions, betrayals, and calculated cruelty applied at exactly the right moment. He watched Pope Julius II, a man in his 60s, put on armor and personally lead sieges. He watched rulers who played by the old rules, honest, measured, merciful, lose their states, their cities, sometimes their lives. The men who kept their promises lost to the men who didn't, every time. The books he had been given said this couldn't happen. A good ruler earns the trust of his subjects. A ruler who betrays that trust eventually loses everything. Beautiful theory. He had watched it fail for 14 years. So Machiavelli wrote the book the old advisors had never written. Not, "Here is how a prince should behave in an ideal world," but, "Here is what rulers actually do. Here is what survives contact with reality. Here is what successful rulers did and what happened to those who did not." He wrote it in a farmhouse outside Florence after being arrested, tortured, and removed from office by the regime he was now trying to advise. The torture was called strappato. His hands were tied behind his back. He was hoisted to the ceiling, then dropped just before the floor. 6 times. He said nothing. The man who wrote the most unsentimental book about power in European thought was also looking for a job. But underneath the biography, there was a question no one had asked cleanly before. What if the virtues that make a man good are not the virtues that keep a state alive? Machiavelli wrote that book from a farmhouse. He was broke, out of power, and looking for a job. 2 centuries later, a prince who already had a kingdom decided to prove him wrong.
The castle at Rheinsberg sat on a small lake north of Berlin. A 24-year-old prince had been given it in 1736 by his father, partly as a reward for good behavior, partly to keep him at a safe distance from court. He had survived a childhood that included a flogging father, a court-martial for desertion, and watching his closest friend beheaded at his father's order. He had learned to act like the perfect obedient son, but he kept a part of himself that his father could never reach. At Rheinsberg, that part of himself had room. He read for hours each day, philosophy, history, French poetry. He played the flute, well enough that Quantz, the finest flutist in Europe, came to teach him. He wrote letters to Voltaire, who wrote back. He was corresponding with the most famous living writer in Europe as an equal, and Voltaire was not pretending. It was at Rheinsberg that he began Anti-Machiavel. The argument was simple. Machiavelli had looked at the worst rulers of his time and concluded that deception and cruelty were necessary instruments of power. But this, the prince argued, was a confusion of means and ends. A ruler who governs through fear creates subjects who obey only under compulsion. A ruler who governs through trust creates subjects who actually want the state to function. Honesty was not just morally superior, it was strategically superior. He wrote Anti-Machiavel before he had to test any of its ideas against reality. Voltaire edited the manuscript. He softened some passages, sharpened others. The two men exchanged drafts across the distance between Rheinsberg and Paris, a prince and a philosopher, working together to prove that power and virtue could coexist. The book was published in September 1940. On May 31st of that year, the prince's father had died. His name was Frederick. He was now King of Prussia.
Caesar Borgia had a province in chaos. Bandits, feuding lords, no law. He sent in a man named Ramiro de Orco, brutal, efficient, effective. Ramiro restored order through fear. Then, when the work was done, Borgia had Ramiro executed in the public square and left the body there for the citizens to see. The cruelty that built the order and the cruelty that ended it were both calculated. Both served a purpose. The province became stable. Machiavelli watched this happen. He did not call it evil. He called it skill. The rulers who followed the old code, merciful, consistent, transparent, kept losing to rulers who did not. And yet, there is a problem buried inside the logic that Machiavelli never fully resolved. His system requires a ruler who can read every situation correctly, who knows when to be the lion and when to be the fox, who can apply cruelty precisely enough to build order without tipping into the resentment that destroys it, who can break a promise at exactly the right moment and keep one at exactly the right moment. In chapter 25, Machiavelli admitted something quietly devastating. "A man cannot change his nature," he wrote. "The cautious man will be cautious even when boldness is required. The bold man will be bold even when caution is required. Fortune changes, men do not." The problem is that the entire system depends on a ruler capable of judging every situation correctly. And Machiavelli himself doubted that such a ruler was likely to exist. He knew this. He wrote it down. Then he kept going. In 1739, a young prince read Machiavelli and believed the problem had a different solution. Not a better prince, a better principle.
Frederick became King of Prussia on June 1st, 1740. Within the first month, he abolished torture from judicial proceedings. He opened the royal granaries to prevent bread prices from rising after a failed harvest. He declared that every Prussian was free to choose their own path to salvation, Catholic, Protestant, or otherwise. He reduced the ceremonial fuss around the monarchy. He toured the kingdom and refused to be greeted with formal processions. Europe's philosophers were delighted. The enlightened monarch had arrived. He was not performing, or rather, there is no evidence he was performing. The letters he wrote that summer are the letters of a man who believed what he had written at Rheinsberg. He wrote to Voltaire constantly. He was running a state, conducting diplomacy, reorganizing the army, and still finding time to discuss philosophy with the most famous writer in Europe. He told Voltaire that the death of the old emperor had complicated things, that events were moving faster than he had expected, that his peaceful intentions were being tested by circumstances he had not anticipated. He was 28 years old, governing 4 million people, trying to prove that a state could be run on rational and humane principles. For a few months in the summer of 1740, it looked like he might be right. Then, on October 20th, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir. Frederick received the news 6 days later. He was ill in bed. He immediately sent for his minister and his senior general. He wrote to Voltaire that the emperor's death had upset his peaceful intentions, that the old political system was now in flux, that he needed to recover from his fever because he needed his body to take advantage of the circumstances. He was already thinking about Silesia.
Chapter 15. A prince who wishes to maintain his position must learn how not to be good and use this knowledge or refrain from using it as necessity requires. Not be cruel, not lie always, not abandon virtue entirely. Learn how not to be good and know when. Machiavelli was not saying that good men make bad rulers. He was saying something more precise, that a ruler who is committed to being good under all circumstances has surrendered the most important decision in politics. He has decided in advance, before he knows the situation, before he knows what the situation requires. He has tied his own hands. The ruler who keeps his promises even when breaking them would save the state, loses the state. The ruler who refuses cruelty even when cruelty would prevent a greater cruelty, causes the greater cruelty. Machiavelli had a name for what happens next. He called it necessity. Not evil, not choice, necessity. The commitment to virtue in the wrong moment becomes its own kind of violence. The old advisors had a word for this. They called it integrity. Machiavelli called it a method of losing. And here is the part that is hardest to dismiss. He was not describing how power should work. He was describing how it does work. Every ruler who had ever held a state together had made exactly this calculation, whether they admitted it or not. The ones who never admitted it were simply less honest about what they were doing. If you are not willing to abandon virtue when the state requires it, why are you a ruler at all? There is no clean answer to that question. Machiavelli knew it. He left it open. He moved on. Frederick knew the argument. In October 1740, he had to decide whether it was true.
On October 20th, 1740, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died. He left no male heir. His daughter, Maria Theresa, was 23 years old and untested. Every major power in Europe, including Prussia, had signed a treaty guaranteeing her succession. Frederick was ill in bed when the news arrived 6 days later. He sent immediately for his minister, Heinrich von Podewils, and his senior general, Field Marshal von Schwerin. On October 28th, the three men sat together in a room in Berlin. What followed was not only a discussion of Silesia, it was the first time Frederick had to test the ideas of Anti-Machiavel against a decision that mattered. Silesia was Austria's northernmost province, wealthy, mostly Protestant, geographically close to Berlin. Prussia had ancient dynastic claims to parts of it. The claims were weak. Frederick knew they were weak. He had studied the maps, the treaties, the legal arguments. He asked Podewils to assess them. Podewils assessed them. They were, he reported, defensible in some cases, indefensible in others. Frederick's response was not to strengthen the legal case. It was to note that he had 80,000 soldiers and a full treasury. Austria had neither. The decision was made in that room. For 7 weeks, nothing visible changed. Letters went out. Diplomats received their usual responses. Frederick wrote to Voltaire. On the evening of December 14th, he gave a masked ball in Berlin. The guests danced. There were candles and music and the ordinary theater of court life. Frederick was present. He was a gracious host. When the ball ended, he called for his aides to camp. He rode south through the night at the head of his army. Silesia was not taken on December 16th. It was taken on October 28th, in a room in Berlin.
Here is what the prince actually says, stripped of 5 centuries of reputation. A ruler who is always good in every situation, under every pressure, without exception, has made a decision before the facts arrived. He has committed in advance to a course of action regardless of what the situation turns out to require. Machiavelli's argument was that such a ruler has surrendered judgment in advance, and judgment, the capacity to read a situation and respond to what it actually is, not to what your principles require it to be, is the one thing a ruler cannot outsource. Machiavelli was not saying that power makes good men evil. He was saying that power places people in situations where the available choices are all bad, and someone still has to choose. That argument is not elegant. It does not make for an inspiring political philosophy. It does not tell rulers how to be good. It does not comfort the people who are governed, but it describes something real. 500 years after Eyre, the argument remains difficult to dismiss. 1741, Frederick writes to Podewils.
1739, Rheinsberg. The manuscript is finished. A ruler who governs with honesty will govern better. 1740, The Hague. The book is published. Voltaire edited it. Every court in Europe reads it. 1740, May. Frederick's father dies. Frederick is king. 1740, June. Torture abolished, granaries opened, religious freedom declared. 1740, October 28, a room in Berlin. Podewil, Schwerin, the maps of Silesia. 1740, December 14th, a masked ball. 1740, December 16th, 25,000 soldiers cross the border. Silesia falls in 7 weeks. 1741, the Foreign Ministry drafts the official justification. Frederick reads it. Bravo! That is the work of a good charlatan. 1741, Frederick writes to Podewils, "If it is to our advantage to be honest, let us be honest. If deceit is necessary, let us be cheats." The letter was intercepted by Austrian intelligence. Anti-Machiavel continued to be printed. Frederick never withdrew it, never revised it, never published a new preface explaining what he had learned. The book simply existed alongside everything that came after it.
Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must learn how not to be good. Frederick spent 4 years arguing that he was wrong. Anti-Machiavel went through more than 50 editions during Frederick's lifetime. He never withdrew it. The easy reading is that he was a hypocrite. The harder reading is that he wasn't. That he believed every word he wrote at Rheinsberg and discovered in October 1740 in a room in Berlin that it made no difference. Next, the philosopher who said freedom was written into history itself, and the state that used his words to end it.